assassinated. One of the doctors who tried to save him that night, who happened to be at the theater, innocently went to the play that night like anybody else, was in the front row balcony, and after the assassination, when Mary Lucia started to yell out and say, "Doctor in the house, water," they shot the president, and a couple of surgeons tried to get up to the box. One of them was Dr. Charles Sabin Taft, who was a Union Army surgeon who happened to see at the play that night. He'd spent the war at a hospital right near the White House, treating wounded Union soldiers. He got off from work early that day. He and his wife went to the theater like everybody else. Lincoln was going to be there. It was a great popular comedy. And he, another surgeon, tried for several hours to save the president's life. Dr. Taft, after the Civil War, moved up here to Mount Vernon. He lived on South 7th Avenue. He was a local celebrity in some ways, as the surgeon who tried to save Lincoln. Dr. Taft died in 1900. He is buried here at St. Paul's Church. So that is our link to Lincoln on the very last day of his life. Right? But that is not the greatest introduction. We're talking about the living Lincoln here. The Honorable Abraham Lincoln, Mr. President, sir.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you, do you think, and I have this from listening endless hours to one of the world's leading Lincoln experts, was he a regular, a fast talker, or a slow talker, or regular? What would you guess?
Thanks.
Any other guesses?
This is slow.
What I've got it in my cell phone. His name I'll tell you after the talk. But he said that Lincoln spoke at 115 words per minute. And the average speaker speaks at 150 words per minute. So it was very, but I think they said the experts said he could, without amplification, which you all know they didn't have back then, he could, a crowd of 8,000 people could hear him. And I think speaking slowly and loudly, I think that's how he was able to get 8,000 people to hear him speak. I couldn't imagine. I'm lucky to get a few hundred. 8,000, I can't even imagine how 8,000 people could hear him. He must have had a very strong voice box, but very admirable speaker. But the other question about his speech is, Would you guess that it was deep baritone, or was it regular or high-pitched? Any guesses here?
Deep baritone.
I think he was high-pitched.
It was actually, all the historians say, very high-pitched, that they were shocked to see him, such a masculine man. They said he was always the strongest and the tallest and the biggest and the strongest, and then to see him, and that his voice made people a little uncomfortable. It was a little high-pitched. But once they started listening to the actual words, they felt comforted by what he had to say. So I like to pray, think that he had a high-pitched voice like mine. I hope it's not more high-pitched than mine. But I'm going to ask, this is a democracy, I'm going to ask you what the next speech is that I'm going to recite to you. And it's the London Spectator I'll give you a clue. The London Spectator said about this speech, I want you to guess which one it is. We cannot read it without a renewed conviction that it is the noblest political document known to history and should have for the nation and the statesmen he left behind something of a sacred and almost prophetic character. Any guesses? Which speech? And all the experts are just overwhelming consensus. This speech I'm going to read now, they say that's his absolute best speech. Any guesses? It was his last speech. It was his second inaugural. And it was very brief. It was only about a little over 700 words compared to the first inaugural, which was very long. And his longest speech actually was in 1860 when he spoke at New York City at Cooper Union. And after that speech, it was over, I think that was over 7,000 words. And then he became a household name that he took the national stage. He's explaining legally the case for why the South had no reason to secede, that the only issue at stake was they didn't want slavery to expand to the territories, but the Republicans sincerely had no intentions of interfering with the South's institution of slavery. So what I'd like to do is recite the second inaugural. It's very brief, and it's, like I said, after you hear this, I hope you'll agree it's almost like he's a prophet, but I'll explain afterwards why that is. Fellow countrymen, and this is on March 4th, 1865, fellow countrymen, at the second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Then a statement somewhat in detail of a course to be pursued seemed fitting and proper. Now at the expiration of 4 years, during which public declarations have been constantly called forth on every point and phase of the great contest which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation, little that is new could be presented. The progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is as well known to the public as to myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging to all. With high hope for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and defied effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetrate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance and wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses, for it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war might speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So the reaction from the Frederick Douglass called it a sacred effort, and Lincoln himself thought that this second inaugural, which offered a theodicy of the Civil War, was better than what I read originally, the first speech, the Gettysburg Address. And I'd like to diplomatically point out the abolitionists were a bit unhappy with this. They didn't want, they really wanted to punish the South, or at least they wanted at least some of the leaders to be punished, but there were actually very few people punished. The only people that were punished were the 4 co-conspirators who afterwards shot Lincoln, and then one of the men running from the southern the prisoner of war camps, that he was also hung for being especially brutal. But other than that, there weren't these massive hangings, and there were no repercussions. It was the thought that they were to give the land from the plantation owners to the former slaves, and then that was the plan of the abolitionists. But then Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat from Tennessee, as you know, he reneged on that, and then he was subsequently the Republicans tried to impeach him, and they got very close to it. They were off. You need to impeach somebody, it's got to go through the House and then through the Senate. By the Senate, you've got to get 2/3 of the vote. And I just heard it this morning. They said they were off by 1 vote. But after he was chastised after that, so he toned it down. But then afterwards, he did become less pro South, and then they tried to. They sent soldiers down to the different courthouses in the South and the capitals just to make sure that the blacks weren't being discriminated against, or that their rights weren't being taken away. But getting back to the second inaugural, do you have any questions about that? There's a lot of references in the Bible about where he says about the offenses, and that's a direct quote out of the Bible, where it says, the woe due to those by whom the offense came. And the Bible talks about that, about offenses. So, and I know one historian was mentioned that other presidents at the end of the speech, they say, well, we hope God is on our side. But this is the first speech in history where God has made mention of actually, and in the actual main course of the speech, and that's why it's biblical that he's saying, like a prophet, he's saying we should forgive with malice towards none, but we should show great forgiveness. And the South, they were hoping for more of a victory speech. And
You mean the North wanted more of a victory?
like the abolitionists wanted a victory speech, and they really wanted more consequential actions. They felt justified but Lincoln felt, so strongly that at that point, General Lee was still fighting. He didn't surrender until, that's why he says here, the progress of our arms, upon which all else chiefly depends, is well known to the public as myself, and it is, I trust, reasonably satisfactory and encouraging, with high hopes for the future, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. So at that point, General Lee is still fighting Ulysses S. Grant, and then they start, like about 3 weeks after the speech, they start corresponding, and Ulysses Grant says, let's meet, let's talk about maybe some kind of surrender would come. And then, Lee, who had been at West Point, was very, very formal and wanted to surrender his sword. And Ulysses S. Grant was much more not formal like General Lee, and said, I don't need your sword, just go home. And that was it. That was the end of the war, basically. And then but Jefferson Davis was still wanted. He just couldn't accept it, the defeat, and he was still running around and hiding. But actually, General Lee, Robert E. Lee, actually stood up and actually wrote letters to the South and told people, this is the time that we heal the nation. It's very important that we stop fighting. So he actually. But I always find on a personal level how shocking it was that he fought so hard against the Union, because his own father was one of, did you all know this? His own father was one of George Washington's trusted military commanders, and it was just so shocking that he would fight so hard against, with his patriotic background, but what happened was that he was in the same church with Jefferson Davis, and the federal troops were coming into Virginia, and he was just the whole thing. Like he said that the Civil War he was against the Civil War, but then once he got caught in Virginia, and then once he started fighting, he just couldn't give up. He was just his historians today say he's the best general in American history, from his tactics and strategy and how small his forces were and how many times they were almost able to defeat the entire. If it wasn't for Gettysburg, that so many times he was able to defeat the Union troops. Do you know why the Union wasn't at first? Does anyone venture a guess why they weren't able to, even though the Union had much better supplies, much greater numbers? Does anyone want to venture a guess?
Why they weren't what?
Why the South had so many successes, why the Union didn't have successes in the beginning, even though they vastly outnumbered the South. Like General Lee's forces were very small forces, and then he kept on beating much larger armies. Can anyone tell me why that happened? It's actually very simple that he had this West Point training that you keep on fighting, that you just keep on, and that they didn't have as much supplies to slow them down, so they were more nimble. They could move around more quickly, go here, go there. They could quickly retreat, regroup, and then re-attack. And then the generals, and I know all about this because I played the last 2 years in a row. I played Lincoln in 1862, where I'm complaining about the generals not doing what I say. But the generals just didn't want to incur losses, so they always backed off. And it wasn't until Ulysses S. Grant got involved, and then finally he had so many successes that he became the brigadier general. He became Lincoln decided that he should be in charge of all the generals, and then people were sending off letters to Lincoln complaining and saying, "Oh, he's a drunkard, and he's too rough on us, and the losses are too great." And Lincoln's response was, "Oh, he's a drunkard, and his losses are too great. What is he drinking? I'm going to send the same amount of liquor to the other generals and hope they come up with as much successes as he does," because he wouldn't back down either, and that's how Ulysses Grant realized that the Union had higher numbers. If they had 200,000 troops and the Confederates had 100,000 troops, then he knew through attrition that even if each battle was just like a 1-to-1 loss, that the Union would eventually win. And the other generals didn't want to do that. They didn't want to go in. They couldn't go in there with 50,000 people and come back with 30,000 and then have losses of 10 to 20, such great losses they couldn't stomach it. And the only people who could stomach such losses was these drunken generals, because I guess if you're not drunk, you can't. You can't do it. You're too.
General Gates, who had the largest force, never moved. He didn't move his forces, and that Lincoln was very unhappy with him, and eventually got the grant.
In fact, they make mention of this, that after Gettysburg, General Meade could have, because there was a terrible rainstorm and they couldn't get over the Potomac, and Lincoln wanted Meade to keep on fighting, yes, to the last man, and that the Civil War would have been over on July 3rd, 1863. It would have been over, and Meade just had only, in the History Channel, they said he'd only been a general for like a week, and so he just didn't. He said his army had been badly beat. Despite the fact that they had won, there were still tremendous losses. There was about 25,000 on each side, and he just couldn't do it. He just felt like, we're not in this, we needed a little more time to recuperate. And Lincoln actually broke down, and his son Robert reports that's when he saw his father break down and cry hysterically, because he knew that the Civil War would continue for a long time if we didn't, he knew it could have ended right there, right then and there. So I wanted to ask you a few
The war
questions.
also was elongated by the slaves were subscribed, that is, the northern and southern armies took them into their army.
That's true. At some point, that they're actually, what they said on the History Channel is they had fierce debates about this in the South, like they were going to do a massive enlistment of the colored slaves, but then I think it was a very narrow defeat. They said, if they're good enough to fight on our level, then how can we justify them being slaves as being inferior to us if they're fighting alongside with us? And that was their downfall, but that is true to some extent. They were, and they voted on it, and they decided not to do it. But then that's what this whole play is about. I was in Mount Pisgah Baptist Church in Brooklyn on every New Year's Eve. It's set in 1862, where I have long discussions with Frederick Douglass. Comes in there and scolds me something fierce and says, you can win the battle, you can win this war if you just bring in the black soldiers. And Lincoln gets scolded by one of his secretaries, one of the ministers, and because Lincoln's afraid of white backlash. They're afraid that, But it turns out that in the play, it shows that Lincoln's having these discussions with Frederick Douglass, and he says, look, the American people don't want colored soldiers. The War Department doesn't want colored soldiers. And so, but Lincoln realizes that is the one thing that the South has over us. And the newspapers of the South bragged about it, that they said a normal army can only take a certain percentage of the male population out to the battlefield, but we can send out a much higher percentage of males because we have the slaves to take care of the farms. And so, Lincoln realized that they didn't have the factories and the industrial factories and the extensive telegraphs and the extensive heavy rail lines that they had in the North, but he knew that was what they had. And this is what they also mentioned on National Geographic. The value of the slaves was more than all of the wealth of America, all of the banks and the railroads. And so Lincoln knew that this was to, as a necessary war measure, he had to do this. But, since we're on the subject matter of President's Day and slavery, I looked at the AbrahamLincolnOnline.org website, and this is a very important question that was brought up on this website. Did Lincoln own slaves? And the reason it's important is twice I get into heated disputes with people dressed as Lincoln when they said to me that Lincoln owned slaves, and I said, I'm never going to let that happen again. I'm never going to get emotional like that again. And I'm just going to ask them point blank, and I'm going to ask you point blank, how many presidents owned slaves at any point in their life? Does anyone know?
I think all of them did.
Sorry?
I think all of them did.
Not all of them. It was like under, not all of them, because it ended at, after the 13th Amendment outlawed slavery, so it had to be before, any presidents who had slaves, it had to be before 1865. So do you want to venture a guess how many presidents had slaves at some point during their life? Make a guess.
15.
close, it was 12. Let me go over it very quickly. Okay, this was, I looked